Downloadable games come home. CD-based systems are on the rise, and the PS2 eats Dreamcast lunch before either's launch. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. I'm your host, Carl, together with my co-host,
Peter. Welcome to take 2 of this month's podcast.
Yes, we've had a little bit of a technical difficulty, so the 1979 jump, this is our second take on it, so if it seems a little less spontaneous than usual, just wait until we get to 89 or 99. We haven't done those yet. And, hopefully Audacity doesn't kill the file a second time, but we should be okay. As always, we're going to be looking at the biggest stories in and around the video game industry in May of 1979, 1989, and 1999. As always, we'll mostly be using magazine cover dates for the 20 and 30-year jumps while relying on newspaper articles and historical documents for the 40-year jump, as well as magazine cover dates for the 40-year jump, as there weren't many dedicated gaming publications on the market yet back then. So, with no further ado, let's turn on the time machine and go back to May of 1979.
Capcom is founded.
That's right, Kenzo Tsuchimoto, and I'm probably killing that name, founder of IREM, the makers of games such as R-Type and Kung Fu Master and the absolutely brilliant In the Hunt, starts a new company called IRM Corporation on May 30th, 1979. At this time, Tsuchimoto was still the head of IREM as well as the new company, but he would leave IREM in 1983, and IRM, not IREM, IRM, would combine with one of its subsidiaries, the Japan Capsule Computers Company Limited, to form Capcom. And of course, go on to make classic games such as Ghosts and Goblins, Strider, Final Fight, Resident Evil, and of course, Street Fighter.
And of course, Monster Hunter.
And yes, Monster Hunter. Not the first go-to I would have when thinking about Capcom franchises. And I know there's a million screaming American listeners right now who are saying, wait a second, you left out the biggest, most important classic Capcom franchise, Mega Man. Sorry, didn't grow up with an NES. No frame of reference. So yeah, that's just one of those things. Capcom has such a wide variety and history. Be it if you're an arcade player, be it if you're an NES player, be it if you are a modern gamer. You are going to have different reference points for this company that just basically doesn't seem to really ever have a true downturn in their output. I mean, they've had years that were better or worse, maybe a few too many Street Fighter spin-offs, but for the most part, always a quality company, going all the way back to its founding.
Also, there's going to be a Monster Hunter movie, so they're going to be fine.
Oh yeah, the Monster Hunter people will be more than happy with whatever they get put in front of them. Just like the Sega people were super happy with the Sonic trailer that came out a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, I heard of that. Did they already change the design of Sonic?
We're not going to talk about that yet. We still have at least 20 years wait time before we get to that story.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So, let's move on to our next headline from 1979.
Cosmac VIP profiled in Kiloboard magazine.
That's right. Now, the Cosmac VIP was originally released in 1977, and it was a home computer kit brought out by RCA. Now, RCA, famous company, big in radios and television sets. They're the ones, with the dog listening to his master's voice. It had a variety, and now the machine itself had a variety of add-on boards and boasted color graphics, 8 colors. and an alphanumerical keypad that allowed for hexadecimal programming entries. Huge deal for a home machine in 1977. Remember, 77 is also the year of the Trinity. It's the year of the Apple II, the Commodore PET, and the Trash 80. So this is one of those systems that, while not part of the trilogy, not the big game-changing machines, definitely doesn't get as much appreciation as it should. And this article in Kilobaud magazine really goes into what you can do with the machine, how to program for it, what its capabilities are, and they also concentrate quite a bit on how it is a good games machine. And they do acknowledge that the home market is a game-centric market.
So what kind of games were made for this computer?
Well,
kind of thing?
You weren't going to be doing any big, massive games, but you could do your typical ball and paddle games, you could do your little shooting games, you could do hunt around a maze games.
So you could do means you had to program them yourself? You
had to program them yourself or enter in listings that you got out of magazines or books.
Listings in
Yes.
magazines?
Yes.
So they basically printed the code in magazines?
They printed the code in magazines.
No shit.
Yeah, of course. And this is something to remember. When you're dealing with a very small amount of memory, and you're dealing with very, very expensive medium at this point. So a lot of these machines, disk drives are way out of the question. The disk drive would cost more than the computer itself quite often. And you might have a tape drive, but the easiest way to publish these would be to simply print off the listing. I mean, if you're only dealing with, let's say, 6 or 8K of memory, that's not that many pages of code.
So you went into a video games kind of store, you bought like 3 pages, and there got Pong.
You wouldn't really have a video game style store yet.
Yeah.
It would basically be you could
Toy
go
store.
down. No, you might just go down to your local
Library.
supermarket
Oh.
and buy a computer magazine off the shelf.
And how did game programmers earn money by then? By selling the code to the magazines?
Exactly, yeah. They would submit it to the magazines. One of the famous magazines of this time was called Softside. Mm-hmm. And every month they would publish programs, but at the same time, in addition to the programs being printed in the magazines, you could also order tapes of those programs for your computer.
Can you imagine how that would look like today? Like, hey, give us $50 and here's this book and type this into your computer and you have this AAA rated game.
Well, yeah, that book would be a massive Bible. I mean, also because the graphics would have to be designed somehow. So
yeah, sure.
You just couldn't do it nowadays. But it was a way for bedroom coders to get their programs out, to make some money off of the code, and their names were printed in this. So a lot of companies would be looking at this and say, ooh, this is a really cool game, and might try to contact that person and hire them off. Or a lot of games that later got published got their start in a more basic format in these magazines. And even some established game creators, like Scott Adams, who was famous for popularizing text adventures on home computers with Adventureland and other titles like that. He was also publishing smaller abbreviated versions of these games.
Here's the demo.
Basically, yeah. Here's the demo, and you want something more? Send me some cash, I'll send you the game. Because there was no retail space for this yet. There were no computer stores. So these magazines become the key element for the distribution of software.
This is fascinating. So you went to your mom and be like, Mom, can you send this random dude some cash? He really promised to send me Pong or whatever.
Yeah, basically.
Awesome.
But remember, it's not that unusual at this point to be ordering stuff out of magazines. It's a system people are used to.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
the catalog system was still huge at this point. So, I mean, as a kid, and many people will remember this if you're the right age, you didn't go to the toy store and pick out what you wanted for Christmas. You didn't tell mom or dad what Santa was supposed to bring by pointing at it on a shelf. You had either the Sears catalog or the JCPenney catalog, or another big catalog in Germany, it was the Quelle catalog. And you pointed out you could see every toy that you knew you were going to be able to get. Because if you ordered it from the catalog, you were actually going to get it, as opposed to going to the toy store and hoping and praying that you weren't left with just the one toy nobody wanted, the character nobody cared about. And so the idea of sending this guy money and he'll send you the product was completely acceptable. Yeah, at different times.
No, sure. I can see that.
Hey, you still send your money to Steam before you've downloaded the game. It's just the pathway for doing it is much shorter. But you still trust that Steam is not going to disappear and take all of your software with it.
Yeah, sure. The system is the same. True.
Exactly. Basically the same, you just had to wait a little bit longer for a result. But yeah, so the Cosmac is really presented as this affordable, game-centric computer for beginners. At launch in 1977, it was retailing for $275, and by 1979, it is now a sub-$200 computer, which, especially in comparison with the other systems out on the market, is super cheap. And especially if you want to just code some little games and stuff, is basically a more interactive or more learning-based games machine than something like an Atari 2600. It's a very interesting idea. And even to this day, there are still people coding games for this old system. And we'll include a link to some videos of those games in the show notes. So just look down below and you'll see those. Okay? That's enough, I think, about the Cosmac. What else we got?
Play cable test markets announced. I really have problems with this headline. I don't know why. Play cable test markets announced. Test markets.
Yeah.
It's
three nouns in a row. It's not that difficult. It's if we were doing it in German, it would be one long word.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah.
There's way too much space between those words. Way too much.
Yeah.
Play cable.
Yeah, Play cable. So 3 cities have been announced as test markets for the Play cable system. Now, this was the first system that allowed people to download console games to their console over a network. The console in question was the yet unreleased, well, at least unreleased to the masses, the test markets were already running, Intellivision from Mattel. A special adapter would be needed to download the game data. The service would officially launch in 1980 and run until 1983. It never got wide adoption due to the cost of the hardware for both the consumer and the operator, but it did realize a lot of the potential and the dream of data services that we've been talking about for the last few months here on the show.
So this Intellivision console was connected to a server from who actually sent you the game?
Well, your cable company, the cable television company.
Oh, so they bought the rights to the game and then they, saved them on some servers and you could download them.
I'm not quite sure what the contractual relationship was between the Play cable company, the cable company, and the makers of the games. Remember, this is the manufacturers are the only ones making games for the consoles. Activision has not been formed yet. So we do not have third-party publishing yet. So at this point, the only games available for the Intellivision are games created by Mattel for the Intellivision.
Okay.
So now, granted, over the lifetime of the Play cable, this will change. But my assumption here, and it's always dangerous to be assuming about things in history, but my assumption here is that we're talking about Intellivision games. And Play cable was either a contract deal between Mattel and some outside party, or it was a Mattel-based initiative. Either which way, what it ends up being is a modem with rewritable RAM that you plug into the Intellivision expansion port. And
RAM. So when you switch off the console, the game is gone.
Well, and this, I do not know whether or not these were rewritable, whether or not it was storage RAM. I cannot say. I haven't looked that deeply into the specs of it.
Okay.
It's very possible that it would have survived a reboot, but I honestly don't know. But what we do know is that the games were being broadcast on a loop over FM channels on the cable service. So this meant that there was a big or relatively big chunk of the cable company's bandwidth that could have been used for television shows and the like being occupied by these up to 8K games that had to be constantly sent out, so that when you turned your Intellivision on, turned it to a certain channel, the Intellivision modem could intercept that signal and record the data to the internal memory. And
so they basically had to block a channel just for one game.
How much bandwidth it actually took up, whether it was a full channel or part of a channel, honestly I don't know, but it was part of the bandwidth. So you would have been eating up a considerable chunk of the bandwidth. And you would have also had to been running a server of some kind to be able to transmit that digital information, even though it was, of course, turned to analog. But you're still running that data out into the cable lines. Of course, people are paying a premium every month to be able to access this, but that premium is, of course, not going to be paid by as many people as something else. And we would later see there were other companies that would try this with the Atari VCS. Probably the one example most people will think of immediately is the old Sega channel, which was Sega's attempt to do the same thing in the early 90s for the Sega Genesis in the United States. I do not believe it ever got any kind of release outside of the United States. It was a US only thing. I was actually in Seattle at the time that launched, I believe 94, 95, and a friend of mine actually did have it. And there you could download the games onto the ROM chip, and as long as you didn't download another game, it was on there even if you weren't connected to the service. They actually released a couple of games that never got cartridge versions in North America this way, including a Mega Man title. Talking about Capcom, the Mega Man title for the Genesis never got a physical release in North America, but did get a release on the Sega channel. So it's very hard to come by in that sense, because the only official version of it in North America would be somebody who still has their Sega channel modem and hasn't rewritten the ROM since then. But yes. So that is the Play Cable system. Nice pioneer, good insight into what was possible, but unfortunately way ahead of its time, and on a system that didn't have the market penetration it needed probably. And then of course in 83 we got the crash, so that's the end of that story.
I mean, it was a test market.
Well, this is only a test market in 79. Yeah. It's no longer a test market when it gets launched in 80, and it lasts until 1983. So it runs for 3 years. It's not a flash in the pan in that sense.
Yeah, just I don't know. I can see how this made any profit for the broadcasting companies.
It was... and
I mean, it was cancelled in 83 after 3 years, so...
Well, yeah, 83 was the end of the console business in the United States completely. It just, everything got wiped out.
Armageddon.
It was... we'll get there, don't worry. Dear listeners, we will get there. Okay, on to other stories.
In 4 years, man. 4 years.
This is a 10-year project. It's all good. We'll get there.
Huh.
Yeah, I'm writing checks. I don't know if I can cash, but it's all good. Okay, get to the next story.
Well, I didn't know what I signed up for when I said yes. Anyway, but many people don't do that. I don't know that. First call goes out for submissions to the Annals of Computing History.
That's right. The Annals of Computing History is a scientific journal that is still running to this day. They are doing proper historical research and writing about the evolution and history of the computing industry. Now, the fact that they have put out a press release that is cited in Creative Computing magazine, and they're looking for submissions, they're looking for people to write articles for this journal, is saying quite a bit. It's this acknowledgement that this is an industry, it is something of import, and it is something with history. And we had this very special moment where a lot of it was new enough that you could actually chronicle it with people who were there. But at the same time, it also goes back far enough that we were losing a lot of people already in 79. People who had done work during World War II on big computers. People who had worked in the 1950s on computers. These were not your kids. These weren't your bedroom hackers. These were, people with doctorates and engineers and so forth who, when they were working on this stuff, were probably already in their 40s or 50s. So add another 30 years on top. They're dropping like flies. And the Annals of Computing History has been a valuable resource for maintaining that history since their inception in 79. And it's kind of cool to see how they got started.
Fascinating.
Yes. And as contributors to the archiving of video game and technology history, we take our duties here very, very seriously.
Oh, yeah.
And hopefully can someday be counted amongst the ranks of those that have come before us. And yeah, okay, I'm going to shut up now. Let's get to the next story about toys.
Actually my next goal would be to broadcast this month's episode actually in this month. And maybe we make this.
No, we can't do it because we haven't had enough support from our wonderful Patreons. Well, we only have one Patreon supporter right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mads. But if we get 9 more at $1 a month, we will have enough extra cash on top of what we're already putting in ourselves into the hosting to be able to have enough bandwidth so that not only can we record this at a much, much cleaner quality, but we'll also have enough bandwidth left over to be able to upload 2 episodes this month, so we might actually be able to get the May episode up in May.
And believe us, bandwidth is the problem why we are not broadcasting on time. It's just about the bandwidth.
It's only about the bandwidth. That's the only reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And also, if you give us $9,999, and yes, I said this in the take we did earlier, but I insist, then you guys can get surround sound.
Trust me, if you start to Patreon that much per month,
we are gone.
Yeah. I will quit my day job and do this full time, and you'll get surround sound. You'll get whatever you want. It's all good. Okay, let's get back to work.
Okay, electronic games at a toy fair. No, at the toy fair.
At Toy Fair.
At Toy Fair.
Yes, there's only one proper Toy Fair, and that's the New York Toy Fair.
And this is why I said at the Toy Fair.
Very good. Creative Computing Magazine was at the New York Toy Fair, and they have a long report on the latest electronic toys for the upcoming Christmas season. Now, of course, Toy Fair, everything's got to be ordered early, blah, 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 blah. So we are talking about early in the year. They're already talking about next Christmas.
So you know what you want to save your money for.
Bingo. The electronic game business raked in $125 million in 1978 dollars, that is. And they are predicting a rise to $200 million for 1979. The big challenge in this fast-moving market will be to avoid shortages,
Which
as
didn't
happened
work.
with Simon, which sold out way before demand was met in 78, but at the same time avoid having warehouses full of obsolete products. Despite all of this, a ton of products are being shown, including 9 different electronic baseball games. Now, when we're talking about electronic games here, we are not talking about video games. We are talking about handheld devices. We are talking about tabletop
Game Boys.
devices. Game Boys. No, I'm not talking about Game Boys yet. Those would be a console because they have interchangeable games.
Huh.
These are standalone one-on-one games, usually using some form of LED lights, not LCD.
So you touch something beeps, a light is blinking,
You
that kind of thing.
still have buttons and little joysticks and stuff, but the LCD display where you can actually have artwork turn on and off is mostly being replaced here with LCD, so it's just little flashing lights in the right place to represent a football player moving up and down the field and stuff
So
like
one game consoles.
that.
Or is it more like board games kind of things?
No, they're handheld devices for the most part, or pieces that you put on a table.
Huh.
Yeah. And Simon is a perfect example of this. It's an electronic device. It looks like a little flying saucer with 4 colored buttons on it, and it does little musical beeps and bloops, and the lights underneath the buttons flash in random patterns, and you have to replicate those patterns in order to keep playing, and it progressively gets more difficult. Massive, massive success in 78.
Well, still a success.
Oh, it's still running today. That's
even
true.
from my childhood back in the 90s, I remember some advertisement about, well, it's not called Simon, but
Yeah.
it's the same.
And again, a creation of Ralph Baer, the inventor of the Magnavox Odyssey, the brown box. Granted, he admits to maybe possibly taking inspiration from a prototype machine Atari created a few years earlier, but since they basically copied his Pong design, all's fair in video gaming and war. So, let's take a look at 3 of the devices that the magazine highlighted, and which I thought were especially interesting. So, we've got Electronic Detective, a digital version of the clue mechanic. Now, there's a link to a great ad featuring Don Adams of Great Get Smart and later Inspector Gadget fame in the show notes. And this game basically works like Clue, where you have to say, okay, this person committed the murder with this device in this place and so on and so forth. But because you've got this little electronic device keeping certain tabs and disqualifying certain elements, there's a lot more factors, a lot more options going on in the game than you would normally have with Clue.
So there were electronically enhanced board games.
It is basically an electronically enhanced board game, so there's no board. It's just a pile of cards and a device with buttons that you can put the buttons into.
Okay.
So, yeah. And that's kind of a cool little thing. I mean, it's not pushing the technology, but you can see how the traditional companies are really trying to get in on this at this point. Then we've got Waddington, a British board game company, introduces their Game Machine, which is a multi-game through overlays device that uses an alphanumerical display to represent letters, numbers, dots, and dashes.
The 70s are the times of the overlays, aren't they?
Well, yeah, because you didn't really have another choice. And the overlays will go all the way into the 80s, and you will even see them in the early 90s when we get to the Atari Jaguar. The final console released by Atari had overlays in the controllers.
Really?
Yeah, I'll
How
show you
did
the
it
picture. Well, it did not sell well, but that had nothing to do with the overlays. There were a lot of reasons why the Jaguar did not sell well. But yeah, when we get to the story of the Jaguar, that's some fun stuff. But then we've got to get up to around 94. That's when the Jaguar hits.
5 more years. You're really writing out checks today, man.
So, back to the story. The Waddington machine is basically a calculator with an one-line alphanumerical display, and they really do get kind of creative with all the ways that they can manipulate those dashes and dots on the screen to make different types of games function. And they squeezed as much as they possibly could out of this premise. There's a good digitizer video showing it in motion. The link to it is down below. On an historical note, many online sources list it as being released in 78, and this may have been the date of the original UK release, but I haven't found any confirmation of this, and I also could not find any confirmation of an actual US release. It's very possible that they released it in 78 in Britain, where the VCS hadn't really hit yet and so forth, and there it found some kind of acceptance in the market or filled some kind of hole in the market, and it just wasn't going to make it in 79 in the States.
No.
But if anybody has any information about the game machine coming out in the US, please let me know. I'd love to find out. And
things you can do with a calculator. I don't know. We had a look at the video earlier, and I was just astonished how anyone would spend any amount of money on that piece of technology.
You have to remember, it's Christmas time.
We buy everything.
Grandma goes in there. You don't really know what it looks like. There's no way to test this thing ahead of time. At most, you may have seen a short TV commercial for it.
So there were no things you could use in stores. Like today, in every electronic store, you have a game console or VR, which you can play on and try out.
Yeah, because remember, this is a device that's running on batteries. So even if you plugged it in the store, it won't last very long. Then you've got the cardboard overlays, which you can't just leave out for people to test because...
You can glue them on the machine.
But then you'd only have one game.
Yeah, it's enough. Just...
No, because the whole idea is to show off how all the different games work. And if you truly know that you're dealing with a shit product, pardon my language,
well, sure,
then you don't want people testing it ahead of time.
Fair enough.
Also, it made some horrible, horrible noises. Do you really want that going off in the middle of the store all the time?
No.
Exactly. So I can see how in the UK in 1978 this would have filled a certain hole in the market, a lack of gaming items, and it probably also helped Waddington avoid losing shelf space that it had traditionally had through its non-digital products or non-electronic products. But yeah, they did not stay in this market for very long. This is, as far as I can tell, the only product in this category that they released. And finally, the really interesting item here is Milton Bradley, another board game manufacturer, shows off the Microvision, the world's first handheld console with interchangeable games. Using a 16 by 16 resolution LCD display, the console ended up boasting a library of 12 titles in its lifetime from 1979 to 1983. It was unlike later handhelds in that the console itself only housed the buttons and screen, while the cartridges, which were overlays replacing the front of the machine, determined which of the 12 buttons were active, because they would cover those buttons up, per game, and also include a microprocessor to power the games themselves. Primitive by today's standards, and most of the surviving machines are suffering from screen rot, but how else were you going to play Breakout? They called it Blockbuster on the go. The system also included a licensed Star Trek title, something that may have been a first for the time. So, the Microvision.
Wonderful thing. We also had a look on the video, and I saw this for the first time. I was actually impressed. I was impressed.
It's an impressive little piece of tech.
How many ways there are to make Breakout look different, but still it's Breakout. And I wonder what the Star Trek title must have looked like. Probably like Breakout.
It had 3 positions, so you moved a cannon back and forth between the left side, the middle, and the right side. So it would just jump. And you were
destroying blocks?
And you would shoot at 45-degree angles from the left, 45-degree angles from the right, and straight up from the center. Mm-hmm. And there would be little dots flying by that were the Klingon ships. So the dot would suddenly come from the right and fly to the left, so you had to move the cannon to the other side fast enough and shoot so that you could still hit the dot.
Huh. Yet another version of Breakout.
More or less, yes. But then again, the interaction between a dot and another dot on screen is kind of most games. Be it a modern action game, if your digital sword hits
close
something
enough
else,
to the screen, yeah, sure.
It's all just
a whole
about
lot of dots.
One dot hits another dot, the coordinates match up, and now the program activates something. Ultimately, it's collision detection in its basic form. And also something that Ralph Baer's patents covered in great detail, and was one of the main reasons why he kept getting paid year after year after year, or at least the holders of the patents did. But, that concludes our journey through May of 1979. Let's turn on the time machine and welcome to May of 1989.
Wonderful.
You're welcome.
Third time in
89.
Perfect.
Jesus,
awesome.
why did
you say that again?
CVG.
I was really hoping you would say it again. The Game
Wonderful. Sorry, everybody.
And we lost him on the way.
May of 1989.
Wait, it already launched in Japan and they have the first pick and that's basically it?
Basically, yes. So CVG is
this
computer and video games. Computer and video games was an English magazine, ran for forever. And the way things worked back in the day was that consoles would come out in Japan first, at least a year earlier, before getting released in the West. Part of this had to do with the fact that the market collapses in 83. The Famicom gets launched in Japan in 84. Doesn't actually get a release in the United States until 86, and doesn't really hit big until late 87, 88. That's when the NES finally really takes off. So it's literally 4 years after originally being launched in Japan. And after that, the Japanese manufacturers, who were still very, very dependent on their home market, where the US was always kind of a, well, is this thing going to last, not going to last type of situation, they would wait until they had software in place, they would wait until they had tested stuff out in the Japanese market before bringing it over.
I mean, it's a nice approach.
Yeah,
if the only problem is... If you buy a console, you want to have software.
Well, this is true. The only problem really was that the Europeans then would get it maybe a year after the United States.
When in Japan they had the... not predecessor. What comes after?
The follow-up. They would have the follow-up almost. In some cases, yes. I mean, and Nintendo was really bad with this because they really didn't see the European market as something that they needed to tackle. And so the European rollout of the NES and a lot of the big NES titles was happening.
We have some leftovers in our stores.
After the Super Nintendo had already been launched, they were still launching NES games from 4 or 5 years earlier in Europe.
Well, they had to clean out their warehouses.
Well, you still had to rework it. Remember, they had a different system in Europe than They didn't have NTSC, they had PAL. So you did have to do quite a bit of reworking. It's just it wasn't seen as an important territory, especially because of the computer game, the computer market being so dominant in Europe. So there's a lot of factors that go into this, but the Game Boy was going to be one of the ones where it was almost similar timing. So what we have is the very first picture of the Game Boy. The Game Boy was released on April 21st, 1989 in Japan. So as the May issues are going to press, it's either just come out in Japan or is about to come out in Japan. And the US launch would come in July, and the European release wouldn't happen until September of 1990. So we get an April launch in Japan, a July launch in the US, so pretty similar timings. But Europe doesn't get it for over a year afterwards. So that's just kind of how this ball rolls. The Europeans, as far as consoles back then, get everything late. The idea of a worldwide release is something that really doesn't happen until about the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we will continue to see this pattern, unfortunately, for a while in our episodes. But that's all we have to really say about the Game Boy. But we just saw the Microvision, the first handheld console. Now we see the real follow-up to it 10 years later. An idea whose time has come.
Acclaim and Konami get into the LCD game.
Okay, and console games from Acclaim and Konami, including titles like Double Dribble, Contra, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, will get LCD handheld games. The resurgence of the video game industry and the lack of a proper portable alternative at this point is sparking a resurgence in this market, especially with well-known properties. Most of these would die out pretty quickly after the Game Boy gets introduced, with Tiger sticking with the format the longest.
Were those one-game consoles?
Console, you can't call it a console if you're not changing the games out, or it's not sitting on top of a TV.
So how would you call handhelds?
These are just, handheld LCD games.
Huh.
And what they were basically the same mechanics as we had seen in the early 80s and the late 70s, when the LEDs of the late 70s got replaced by LCD games. Mattel was really big into this market in the early 80s, and later on, a little bit behind. In the early days, you had the US always a little bit ahead of Japan. By this point in the late 80s, as far as console gaming is concerned, Japan is always a little bit ahead of the US. You had the famous Nintendo Game & Watch games, which were the originators of the classic Nintendo controller, the D-pad, the 4-point D-pad with the 2 fire buttons. That comes from those handheld LCD games Nintendo was doing in the early 80s, created by Gunpei Yokoi.
I mean, it's way better than those 12 buttons on the Microvision. I mean, 12 buttons. Well, 10 fingers, 12 buttons.
You didn't use all of the buttons for all of the games.
But why 12 buttons? I mean, weren't like 10 sufficient? You know, and you could just repurpose them on each game.
What kind of game you wanted to do. It gave you options for gameplay. For example, does every PlayStation game today need all 8 buttons plus start and select? So in theory, you're talking 10 buttons on the stick.
Yeah.
And then fingers. You also have the press down options on the analog stick, so now you're up to 12 buttons. Do you need 12 buttons on a PlayStation controller?
For some games, yes.
Okay, there you go. Microvision was just ahead of their time. They knew that at some point you were going to need 12 buttons. They were ready. They were ready for Assassin's Creed, man. Okay, Assassin's Creed on 16 by 16 pixels. Now that would have been a great version of Blockout.
Yeah, I think so. The LCD games, this would be a big fad for a little while. I even delved into it, and I remember buying the Tiger Electronics Gauntlet game at the time, which was kind of cool. Gauntlet game. Yeah, Tiger Electronics was this company that was notorious. We'll see them again at a few junctures. Notorious for sticking with cheap LCD games, and when everybody else got out, they would buy up their licenses. So at this point, we've got Acclaim and Konami who are making regular NES games and then porting them over, or making versions of LCD games using the licenses at least. And Tiger would then later come in. They'd do Sega games and Atari games and basically any license they could get their hands on, movies and so forth. But so we see there's a desire to play on the go. The gaming market's back. Nintendo has revitalized everything. Sega's coming in with the 16 bits. And while the Game Boy is still off in the distance, and Nintendo isn't really advertising it much yet. Like I said, first picture of it in CVG. We have other contenders coming into the market trying to grab a little piece of this. Exactly. Why talk to people when you can look at a screen?
Hell yeah! This did not come just with your cell phones, okay? We've been doing this for generations at this point. So, what else we got?
We have ACE reviews the PC Engine CD add-on. Jeez, your titles, man.
There's a lot of acronyms. This has to fit into the show notes, okay? So this is why the titles are the way they are. So, released in December of 1988, it's the first CD add-on for a console. While it doesn't have much in the way of software, Fighting Street, a port of Street Fighter 1, and a Japanese story game about a girl becoming a pop star, the mag is still quite certain CD-ROM is the future, though, and now the question is whether or not this very pricey bit of import hardware is the way to go. So, for those not in the know, the PC Engine is a game console by NEC. It had an 8-bit CPU, but a 16-bit graphic bus, and I'm hoping I'm getting the technical details right there. It could basically do a whole bunch of colors on screen. For quite a while, according to some of the sources online, the PC Engine was actually outperforming the NES in Japan. So the NES was well established, but the PC Engine was really eating away at some of its market share at this point in time. Mm-hmm. And the add-on of a CD drive that you could enhance the system with, basically give it that extra storage, give it the Redbook audio that would stream from the CD while you were playing, just made it that much more appealing of a system. And NEC is a massive computer company, so they could not only pay to develop this kind of stuff, but also front the bill for manufacturing CD-ROM drives, which at the time were very, very expensive. Now, in North America, this system was known as the TurboGrafx 16. They completely redesigned the look of the device, they gave it a new name, and they would also then release the Turbo CD system.
And how did it work? How did you plug in the CD system into the console?
Well, the console actually had a cartridge slot, and I don't know about the North American version. I believe that the North American version had an expansion slot on the back, so the CD drive would actually sit on top of it with the connection in the back. The Japanese version, it connected on the side, so the expansion slot was on the side. The cartridges that the TurboGrafx used, interestingly enough, were known as Hue cards. They were these tiny little credit card sized and thin little wafers that you would click in and they would play the game. Now these were a little bit limited to the point where games like R-Type, which had an amazing port, arcade shooter game, amazing port to the TurboGrafx 16/PC Engine, actually had to be broken up into 2 Hue cards because it just wouldn't fit otherwise. Which was another reason why the use of the CD was suddenly so very important for the life of the system, because these Hue cards, unlike regular cartridges, you couldn't just keep adding ROM chips inside of them to give them more memory. You were kind of stuck with the Hue card, and you were going to have to find some other way to add more data to the system.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Now, granted, it was only a single-speed CD-ROM drive, so it was going to have some very limited. So. It is, and the console world, it is the first.
Yeah.
By quite a long shot, as our next story will tell us.
Yeah. And I like this title way more. CDI is DOA.
Even before launching, it looks like the much-lauded Philips CDI may already be dead. Almost 2 years before it launches. Continued delays. Yeah,
sorry,
exactly.
But much lauded Philips CDI was dead. Hey guys, something great is coming and it's gonna be dead.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
Now, just to set the stage here, remember, Philips is the company that pretty much launched the CD. Back in the late 70s, they're the company that is running the show with CD. Now, CD, as a format, as a physical format, we all know it's a compact disc. But you had to establish how you were going to read it. There's a reason why every CD in the world will work on any CD player, because they had to establish a standard for what format to write the information onto the disc in. So that every CD player, the laser will move at the right speed, the processor inside of it can decode the audio at the right speed, etc., etc. This is where we get the Red Book standard. Now, there were several other colored books that were different standards for other types of information that should come off of a CD. And the battle at this point, when CDs are moving from an audio medium to a multimedia medium, the question was, how are we going to deal with all of these other types of media? Pictures, interactive sounds, animation, computer programs. How do we establish a standard for all of these things? And most people at this point are still thinking that, CD is just going to be a great way to have an encyclopedia on a disc. They're not thinking games yet. They're not thinking movies. Maybe a couple of movie clips, but that's about it. Nobody's really thinking of the interactive ability to, in real time, pull up information off of a CD and use it, especially because a single speed CD-ROM drive doesn't really have the bandwidth for that kind of thing. But Philips has decided to create their own standard for reading that kind of multimedia information from a disc, and that standard is called CDI. So at this point, most people are thinking CDI is this device that failed, but CDI was primarily a format for encoding data on a CD that could be pulled up by something with a microprocessor like a PC, and would be a standard everybody else would use for this. The only problem is the CDI standard was way too limiting, did not have that future vision of faster drives, interactivity, games, and so forth.
So what was it for?
Well, it was supposed to be this unifying standard the way audio CD, Red Book, was for audio. And unfortunately, it just didn't get the adoption because it wasn't flexible enough. Continued delays of the rollout of CDI-enabled drives, CDI-enabled software for operating systems, and standalone CDI devices mean that what should have been the first CD multimedia entertainment device in the home has been usurped by the likes of the PC Engine CD, which comes to market without CDI support, and later on the Commodore CD TV, which was basically a Commodore Amiga 500 with a CD drive attached to it in a VCR-like console box that you put underneath your TV. Sony has dropped support for the standard and headed over to Microsoft's CD-ROM XA standard, which would be the foundation for all later CD-ROM standards. So basically, Philips, who created the original technology, is not the one who creates the standard for encoding CD-ROM information. Microsoft takes that over. And Microsoft is in the better position for it because it's going to be the PC that is your device for multimedia.
Right.
It's not going to be a boombox.
So Philips brought up the CD. Sorry. Philips brought up the CD, but nothing you can read their CD with. I mean, maybe their CD. But
well,
not
they created
CD.
the CDI standard, yeah. But ultimately, it wasn't the standard for encoding information that anybody else wanted to use. It was just way too limiting at the end of the day. Now, they would end up releasing the CDI as a standalone device. Now, the CDI device is this set-top box. It was a super expensive set-top box. We're going to see it at some point. Super, super expensive. Very, very limited options. They had a deal with Nintendo. The worst Zelda games ever get released on the CDI. As well as a very terrible Mario game, exactly. And they tried to push it as, oh, this will be the center of your entertainment world. The only problem is, video from this thing is too grainy to be usable as a real movie. The interactivity lags way, way behind a standalone game console. And DVD is on the horizon. So ultimately, the CDI doesn't fulfill any real function. Unlike CD with Redbook audio, fulfilled the function of massively increasing the quality of sound, allowing you to have an entire album on one side without having to flip it over, and the ability to easily shift songs around, which were all not possible with traditional vinyl records. CDI doesn't add anything of real value to the consumer, and therefore failed. But it was an interesting stepping stone, and it's an interesting way of seeing how these industry standards do get established. They don't just pop out of nowhere. They have to be created by somebody.
Yeah, sure. Of course. As everything has to.
But it's easy to forget that. So, on to our next story.
Nintendo announces their 1988 results. There you go, 1988. Your topic.
This is why I keep going back to it, because I've been steeped in it. Remember, we're dealing with the publication dates on these magazines. And, of course, it takes a little while to get all your numbers from Christmas and everything together. So
Nintendo has a fiscal year, which is not the normal year.
Of course, they have a fiscal year, but also it's just Christmas time. It takes a while to figure out how many returns you have and everything else.
Sure.
So Nintendo sales have doubled in the industry, with Nintendo seeing a 41% boost in sales, and the traditional 8 to 15-year-old portion of the audience is down to 60%. So what we're seeing here in the Christmas 88, Nintendo still increasing massively, but the age of the players is slightly going up. What we're now seeing is, and this is me speculating a little bit, but I think what we're seeing is the return of the people who played as 10 to 15-year-olds during the first video game boom, 78, 79, 80, 81, are now coming back into the fold. They are starting to rediscover games on the new systems. They are now shifting gears a little bit. And as we've talked about before, Microprose looking for more action-oriented games and so forth. The American computer game publishers are feeling a drop. A lot of the people who were playing computer games the last few years are now shifting back to console. And this is that slightly older shift, which is going to lead to a lot of RPGs and stuff being ported over to the NES and later to the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, because they need to go after this slightly older audience. It's not quite there yet. We're still dealing with 60% of all consumers being between the age of 8 and 15.
So consoles being toys, basically.
Basically still. And this is also why most of the sales are still in the Christmas period. But Nintendo is slowly changing attitudes and making this a year-round product. Next story.
Yeah. 286... What?
286. It's the
I'm
processor.
sorry. Yeah.
I apologize. He's young. He doesn't know. He's a Pentium child. Please, one more time.
286 PCs dominate the Xmas 88. Again, 88. In the USA. I can really see why you want to go back to 88.
We have a huge about a bunch of numbers of coming out of the Christmas season in this May period. So while Europe is still moving from 8 to 16-bit computers like the Amiga and Atari ST, the USA is clearly the land of the PC compatible. Compute's own reader survey shows that 47% of its responding readers used MS-DOS-based machines at home, followed in second place by Commodore 64 and 128 users, and the Apple II, Atari 8-bit, Mac, Amiga, and finally Atari ST users.
I had a MS-DOS machine, 1995, which was my mother's workstation before 1992.
Of course, MS-DOS was around. It went through a lot of iterations. You weren't using the same version, but
surely not.
MS-DOS is MS-DOS. You can actually install the original version of MS-DOS on any standard PC today. It'll still work. The backwards compatibility, man, makes a huge difference. Just ask Mac users. So Xmas sales numbers back this up. Overall computer sales rose 6.7% over Christmas '87, with a 44% gain for the 286-based machines over the year before. The Apple II range fell by 50% over the previous holiday season, partially due to changes in distribution and price hikes. More about that in just a moment. Dealers were not happy with Apple at this point. Tandy, the Radio Shack company, had put a lot of its marketing muscle behind the Tandy 1000 SL, a low-end MS-DOS box using an 8086 processor and only having 256K of RAM. This was not the machine consumers were looking for. Instead, their big seller was the 1000 TL, which had a 286 CPU and the full 640K of RAM on board. Tandy's total number of MS-DOS computers sold was down 13%, but their revenue was stable, which indicates that they made up the difference on the more expensive machines. And this is really important at this point. People are willing to spend more on a computer. They've not looking for the really, really cheap stuff at this point. They realize, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it right.
Yeah,
I'm going
no
to spend
pain, no gain.
No pain, no gain.
What was the price difference between the 1000 TL and the 1000 SL?
The price difference was about $1,000.
Jesus. And what would the 1000 SL cost? It was surely around 500-600?
No, it was a little bit more because remember, you have to buy a monitor. Unlike a computer like the Commodore 64, which you could plug into a television set, you had to buy a monitor. And I don't have the exact prices in front of me right now, but it was a massive price difference, but people were willing to pay it. A good buddy of mine actually had a 1000 TL. It was a 286-based Tandy machine. It could do EGA graphics, as well as the so-called Tandy graphics, which were basically the PC Junior graphics. And I know I'm oversimplifying that. There's other differences, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, it was your EGA machine. It was giving you those 16 colors on screen, which even by this time was kind of terrible looking. I remember scoffing a bit at the graphics, but what they did have was a much higher resolution than the other systems, primarily because it wasn't limited to television output. And the freaking thing had a hard drive. And that makes all the difference in the world. The Amigas and Atari STs that most Europeans are buying, while they could be expanded to have a hard drive, they don't have hard drives. You are running everything off of floppy disks. And that is dramatically slowing down what your machine can do. And there's no real upgrade to CPU, no real upgrade to the video card possible or anything like this, which the Tandy 1000 TL could do. You could put in a new video card. You could put in a faster CPU. You could put in more RAM. It isn't IBM compatible.
Fascinating.
Very much so. And speaking of Apple
misjudges chip shortage.
A few months ago, we talked about the great chip shortage that was hitting the market. Too many producers of computers thought that higher capacity chips would be needed much sooner than they were, bought up a ton of them, causing a shortage and making several producers shift to producing these higher capacity chips. This caused a short glut in the market of high capacity chips that current computers couldn't use, and leaving many high and dry of the smaller capacity chips they needed. According to Compute magazine, Apple's long-term supply contracts expired at the height of the shortage and ended up buying $80 million worth of 1 megabit DRAM chips for as much as $38 each, which at the time of this report were only worth $23. So that's a difference of $15. They apparently
1 month of play cable.
Exactly. They apparently thought high-end Mac sales would be higher, aka they would need more large capacity chips, and that the shortage would last until the end of 1988, aka through Christmas. Neither came though. They then made it worse for themselves by increasing the cost of high-end Macs by nearly 30% and, well, pissing everyone off. Their low-end machines sold better than expected, forcing them to buy 256K RAM chips on the open market, missing the wholesale price advantage. So basically, this is the period where Apple is managed by a bunch of baboons. Okay, Steve Jobs hasn't returned to the company yet. These guys have no idea what they're doing. They can't decide if they're going to kill or keep the Apple II line. They cannot decide what role the Mac should have. Is it a business machine? Is it a graphics machine? Is it just something for people who want to spend more on computers? And they are completely and totally misjudging how much money people are really willing to spend for the Mac Premium. And, well, they just really misjudged this whole chip shortage, unfortunately.
Well, or they didn't do proper marketing. I mean, considering how Apple's marketing strategy is today, premium strategy, sell for high costs.
Yeah, but you can't up the price of your product by 30% and still expect people to buy it when...
What does the new iPhone cost, man?
Well, yeah, but nobody's paying the full price of the new iPhone. They're buying it through their contract.
Yeah, here, yes.
Even in the States. Everywhere. Nobody. If you're buying a new iPhone cash, you are an extreme exception. I'm not saying that it's not financially sound, but I'm saying you're the extreme exception.
Well, but still, even if you get it through your contract, you usually have to pay something in addition,
Yeah, but it's a nominal fee. Even if it's $100, it's a nominal fee. You cannot say that is anywhere representative of the actual market value of the device.
And you up the price of your contract.
Well, of course. And I'm not saying that you're not paying for it.
Right.
You are paying for it, but you're just not paying for it in one fell swoop. They're not getting their money... Well, they're getting their money up front from the telecom provider, but still. Yeah, I mean, they were trying to do this. Unfortunately, they just were not doing a very good job of it. And we will see the internal discussions at Apple at this time about the future of the company and the future of the different lines is going to get a little bit hairy, but we'll talk about that next month. So, on to brighter things.
Maniac Mansion tops German charts for 3 months straight.
The Germans' love for LucasArts point-and-click adventures runs deep, and it shows as Maniac Mansion tops the German charts for 3 straight months. It probably didn't hurt that most action games in Germany were censored or banned, leaving pretty much nothing else but point-and-click adventures, but it is really something that runs deep. Some of the few studios still making point-and-click adventures today in 2019 are still here in Germany. The latest
You're living in the past, man.
I know. The latest reinvention of the Leisure Suit Larry series was developed by a German team. So it is kind of impressive that this gets international recognition. I'm not getting this out of a German magazine. This is actually coming from the American publication Video Games and Computer Entertainment. Another story from that same magazine is...
The first Lucasfilm produced Indiana Jones games are announced.
That's right. Now, the long history of Lucasfilm, and later on called LucasArts, the video game and computer game division of George Lucas's empire, had to survive up till this point without the licenses to Lucas's 2 biggest properties, Indiana Jones and Star Wars. Now, they did work on some licensed products. For example, they created a Labyrinth licensed game based off of the Jim Henson movie, but most of their products have been original products up to this point. Games like Ball Blazer, Rescue on Fractalus, Eidolon, and so forth. And they've always been cutting edge technologically and doing amazing things. So the news that they were finally going to be able to do a Indiana Jones based game, and this was going to be based off of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, marks the first time that they are going to be able to play with the big toys. Indiana Jones and Star Wars licenses were still held by Atari Games up to this point, but with this first game, they were going to delve into the Lucas back catalog. And it wouldn't become their exclusive thing for a few more years, but once it did well, it's pretty much the end of LucasArts. But that's another issue for another time.
Did you play those games?
Oh, yes. The Lucas Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade game developed by LucasArts was a point-and-click adventure game with a couple of little action bits in between. There was a little boxing minigame, but it also had some very interesting branching paths in it, and it was using a relatively early version of the SCUM engine where they hadn't pared down the number of verbs yet, so there was still quite a few words to choose from. But unbelievably atmospheric game, and it probably did more for popularizing the Lucasfilm point-and-click adventures than anything else, just because the license was so huge. Sure. Now, if you weren't an Amiga, ST, or PC player back then, the 8-bit people got an action game license off the movie that was actually not produced by Lucasfilm, but was produced by US Gold, which was an English company.
US Gold, an English company.
Yeah, because they started out as an importer of American games to England.
Ah, okay.
That's why they called themselves US Gold, and then they started branching out from that, licensing arcade games, importing arcade games, but the name stuck. And so their action game gets largely maligned by people, especially in light of the great point-and-click adventure game. I personally found the Commodore 64 version of the game to be spectacular. And yes, I will defend that game. It had some amazing graphical effects. It had some really, for the time, well thought out gameplay. It didn't have any of those, oh, suddenly there's a spike here that you couldn't have seen before that's going to kill you type of deaths. So it was actually quite a bit better than many others. And of course, later on, we also get another point-and-click adventure game, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. And that also got ported to as an action game to the Commodore 64. That game, please never even touch it. It's an absolute hunk of junk. But that's another issue for another time.
Next topic.
Yes.
Project Firestart hits the max.
Okay, and this one really isn't one of those big stories of the world, but it's personal to me, so I thought we should mention it. In my opinion, the greatest 8-bit game ever gets quick write-up in Computer Gaming World magazine.
What was it about?
Project Firestart was I don't even want to call it open world. It was basically the first true survival horror game as we understand it today, but on a Commodore 64. So it was a science fiction game. You are this special commando guy sent to this research vessel. Something has gone wrong. Their boss is not really telling you a lot. You're supposed to recover data files, find out if anybody's still alive, and then get the hell off the ship and set the self-destruct. The game combines multiple camera angles, so some of the spaces are simply left to right horizontal movement. Other ones have depth so you can move in and out. You can interact with the computers, read through emails and so forth, which in a day and age in 89 when there isn't really email for everybody, it was an innovative concept to have in there. There's cutscenes, close-ups of horror scenes. There's all sorts of shock moments, very, very sparse graphics. Not graphics, very, very sparse sound. So there's no ongoing sound in the background, no music playing, just the tap, tap, tap of your feet in these empty halls. And at the same time, you have things like, there's the bathrooms, there's the kitchen, there's the locker room, there's the holodeck, there's the big window so you can look at the back and the front of the ship from the outside. Sometimes you'll just wander around for 10, 12 minutes wondering, okay, what's going on? And you would have to start to map out this ship and then slowly figure out what happened on board the ship. Put the pieces together. Discover that the gun they gave you is not going to really help a lot. And play through this. And it has multiple different endings depending on how you play the game. Fascinating game. Produced by the wonderful company Dynamics, that would also go on to make The Incredible Machine, Rise of the Dragon, Heart of China, Adventures of Willy Beamish, Stellar 7, Nova 9. I can go on and on. I love the company. And a great quote I saw years ago online by Jeff Tennell. He's the head of the company and also the lead designer on the game. The game took way too long. It was being published by Electronic Arts, who had abandoned the Amiga, so it only got released on the Commodore 64. And he famously said that they had no right making that game on that system. So, yeah, load times are terrible and so forth. And if you really want to play it nowadays, I recommend there is a cartridge hack of the game available online. Find that, play that. You will not be disappointed.
So it aged well.
In my opinion, yes. Granted, of course, you're dealing with 16-color graphics and so on and so forth. But if you want to see what Resident Evil would really look like in 8-bit, this is it. So I just thought I'd mention it because it's not a game that shook the world. It didn't get great publicity by Electronic Arts because they just kind of didn't see it as something to go forward with. It just kind of got dumped on the market, but it is a cult classic and it's my show. So, fuck it. I get to talk about it. It's our show, but I'm the one who sets up the schedule, so
fair enough.
It gets talked about. Okay, next.
Game Pro issue number 1 is released.
The long-running Game Pro magazine launches a bi-monthly. It would run for the next 22 years. The first issue didn't have too much groundbreaking news beyond talking about CES, motion control innovations like the Power Glove and U-Force. One interesting bit that is worth noting, though, is an interview with the head of Taito of North America. They were located in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And this guy's name was Alan Fetzer. He mentions that Taito, and I'm probably massacring the pronunciation of that.
Taito.
Taito or Taito. It's one of the two. Don't ask me which. Is he mentions that Taito is watching what Atari is doing with its unlicensed games, which we talked about in last month's episode. And he's really wondering how this is going to play out, what will happen, but it's pretty clear to him that some patent issues may come up there, and Fetzer points out that the market restraints imposed by Nintendo have made the video game market much stronger.
Well, sure, they are not publishing every shit they program.
Well, yeah, not every crappy game is getting out there. There's no overload of the market of terrible software, and this is good for everybody. Now, granted, he may also just not want to piss off Nintendo, but it's also interesting that he's watching this, because if Atari should win and unlicensed games do flood the market, it's going to impact everybody else.
But now you have a whole lot of video game magazines for reviews. Oh, at least some.
Yes, and this is interesting because while computers and video games, the English magazine has been running since the early 80s at this point, because they never had a crash because they weren't a console market. And Computer Gaming World has also been running since the early 80s. This is truly the resurgence of the American video game market. The fact that magazines like Game Pro are starting to pop up shows you that it's not until 1989 that the video game market in the United States is really something that people believe is going to stay. And remember, we are building this off the back of the 1984 hardware inside the NES. So once the Genesis hits, come September, it's going to be truly here to stay. The market is going to be more solidified, but you can feel people want to move on. Something else is going to be
After
necessary.
5 years.
Exactly.
It's like now.
Bingo. So, with that being said, let's turn on the time machine and do our final jump this month to May of 1999. Welcome to May of 1999. Our first story.
PlayStation 2 specs and rumors abound.
Everyone is abuzz with the first specs of the upcoming PS2, which were announced in early March. Sega's wind is being sucked out of its sails just as it was starting to give them some momentum. A rumored fall 1999 launch in Japan wouldn't turn out to be true, instead being launched in May of 2000. But the full 2000 US launch date, October 2000, would come about. Will Sega be able to use their 1 year lead time to have a fighting chance?
No.
Yeah, pretty much accurate on that one, unfortunately. Next Generation Magazine breaks down the numbers and what Sony has shown and what is still open. The PS2, this name hadn't been finalized yet, has a 4-chip core structure with floating point eating up 2 of those. The machine's MPEG-2 decoder capability is on board, as is backward compatibility with the PSX. What isn't confirmed is the machine's ability to play DVD movies out of the box. Next Gen thinks it will, but the announcement would probably eat into Sony's own DVD player sales. The developers that are showing off demos include FromSoft and Square, but more disturbing for Sega is Namco, showing off its virtual model Reiko Nagase, and I'm probably killing that name as well, of Ridge Racer fame, being rendered in real time. Any hope of the big Japanese third party sticking with Sega seems to have been dashed.
They're called From Software, aren't they?
Yeah, From Software. So, From Software are the same guys who make
Dark Souls 1, 2, 3, Demon Souls earlier, and Bloodborne. And I have to say, I freaking love those games.
Exactly. And in the launch library of the original PlayStation, they were also the only RPG available. So they had done a first-person perspective RPG for the original PlayStation.
But this was way before the Soulsborne era.
Exactly. This is 1995. But From Software has a long pedigree in that genre. And, that game was hard as balls as well. So the fact that From Software is showing off PlayStation 2 stuff, and Square, the company that had left Nintendo to come to the PlayStation, that was basically the make or break for a console at the time, is not good.
Death blow to Sega.
Yeah. Pretty much. Now, Namco is a big deal because you might recall we talked about how Namco's support for Sega, using the Naomi board for their arcade games, bringing Soul Calibur out, and there was speculation about what games might still be coming, which basically turned out to be almost nothing later on. But the speculation was still around that Namco might be the ace in Sega's camp to really help propel them forward, to be the ones that give them those games that they so desperately need that are not in-house productions. And, well, it's not looking good at this point already. Now, Sony is pulling a classic move here. Announcing the specs early, letting the rumors fly about how soon this thing is going to hit the market, even though they probably knew just how far off in the future it was, but they needed to make sure that there weren't too many early adopters of the Dreamcast. And at this point in time, I actually remember having discussions with friends about, well, should you buy a Dreamcast or wait? And the argument always turned out, just wait.
Yep.
Sony's coming. If the Sony PlayStation turns out to be a dud, you can always still buy a Dreamcast.
And the Dreamcast library by then will be way larger.
Well, you hoped it was going to be way larger.
Well, right.
It didn't become way larger, but
only if the PlayStation 2 would be a flop. Then it would have been way larger.
Of course.
But this is what Sony is doing right now, isn't it? With the PS5.
As we're recording this,
earlier, they are leaking some rumors about its specs, and you see specs of the development kit here and there.
Exactly. Sony has a big problem. and this is a little bit beyond us, the scope of the podcast, but as we're recording this in May 2018, Sony has just recently released some early specs of what will be the PlayStation 5 at this point.
You're living in the past, man. It's 2019.
I'm just saying it may be too early to say that this is a comparable situation, but...
No. You again said 2018.
I said 2018 again.
Yes, you're living in the past, man.
Oh, I'm getting old. 2019. In May 2019,
Years
as we're
go
recording
by so
this,
fast.
They do. The PlayStation 5 specs have started to circulate. And people are speculating about what they could be and what they couldn't be. And Sony isn't talking about when this thing's going to be released. And there is speculation that Sony is pulling the same trick again, where they are trying to get out ahead of any other kind of machine to sort of disrupt the market. The only problem is, the difference this time is, there is no other contender.
Right.
Microsoft is the only real competition that they have. And Microsoft is going to be using a GPU that is similar to the Sony one. They're all being made by the same company, AMD. The differences in the stats aren't going to really be that relevant for the future. Right now, my feeling is Sony's simply doing it because they're afraid that the market is moving away from a physical console. They are afraid the market is moving towards downloadable content. It's moving towards streaming, possibly, depending on how...
Google Stadia.
Google Stadia. They're really kind of afraid of people saying, well, I don't really care about the consoles. And with the Switch being this hybrid console slash handheld, the Nintendo is out of the game. And Nintendo's doing its own thing.
Yep. Like
Nintendo usually does. And Sony has had so many bad years in so many other areas of its business.
Yeah, that the PS5 has to be a success.
It has to be a success, but at the same time, they don't have the money to build an online infrastructure for streaming, even if they wanted to.
Right. But
Microsoft does. Microsoft could go toe-to-toe with Google if they felt like it. They've got the reserves. They've got the cash in the bank.
Well, and they got the infrastructure already.
And they have the software stuff. And they have the software expertise.
Right.
Sega has also called a conference call to downplay the PS2, but we won't get a report on that until next month. There's also some question about whether or not the system could be used for non-console computing purposes with PlayStation 2. Those aren't the only two players in the market. Who else is still there?
Nintendo. Nintendo's next console is in the works.
First rumors are circulating about Nintendo's follow-up for the Nintendo 64. Not much is known, but it won't be using a MIPS processor this time and will have some kind of disk drive, either DVD or proprietary. These decisions mean that it won't be backward compatible with the N64. Not much else is known, but given that the Big N's two main rivals both have new systems coming soon, they may not want to be too late to the party again.
And yet they were.
Oh,
and also the disc they used, I mean, they could use DVD and this thing could have been used as a DVD player or not.
They were so afraid of piracy. Nintendo always had this thing about piracy. And ultimately, it kind of bit them in the butt. They couldn't play DVD movies, which I think they just underestimated how important that aspect of the machine was going to be.
Yeah.
Just like Microsoft did with the Xbox. They didn't have it out of the box with DVD playback, and it did hurt them. Sony had it out of the box, and it became a massive, massive success for them.
Yeah, sure. I mean, do you buy a DVD player for $150 or do you buy a PlayStation 2 for $200? $299. Okay, double it.
The problem is DVD players weren't $150 at that
back
point.
Then, right.
They were $300. So you could buy a PlayStation 2 at the same price, usually, as a DVD player, at least a good one.
Yeah, same with the Xbox One and the PS4. Do you buy a Blu-ray player or do you buy a console?
Well,
If
most
you're a
people have
player.
decided not to buy a Blu-ray player, period. So
Yeah, sure.
yeah. But yeah, it's one of those situations where they needed to go to disc. The production costs for cartridges were just way too astronomical. And so now that's where we're at. So what will become Project Dolphin, later known as the GameCube, it's on the horizon. And in software news,
Konami announces 5 titles for Dreamcast US launch.
Konami spokesperson told Next Gen that at least 5 titles would be available at launch. The mag speculates that those must be at least including Castlevania and Metal Gear Solid. So I guess there is hope for third-party support after all for the Dreamcast.
I mean, a Metal Gear Solid on the Dreamcast, surely a system seller.
Well, they did get that, but not in the way that they wanted, actually. They got that in the form of Bleemcast. Remember, we talked about the PlayStation emulation a while ago? There was a commercial PlayStation emulator called Bleem for the PC, and they did port it to the Dreamcast, and it called it Bleemcast. And you would buy a disc that would be able to play very specific PlayStation games, and there was a Bleemcast disc, so you could play Metal Gear Solid from the PlayStation on your Dreamcast.
By the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
We can play PlayStation games.
Exactly. That's totally the point of that new
system
device.
seller.
Yes. Especially since the PS2 is going to be backward compatible.
Yeah.
Which, they announced that just to twist the knife on Dreamcast a little bit more. But Konami did release a whopping 6 games for the Dreamcast. They were great classic titles like Air Force Delta, DDR Second Mix, ESPN International Track and Field, ESPN NBA Tonight, Silent Scope, and Nightmare Creatures 2.
Wait, there was a Nightmare Creatures 1?
Oh yeah, Nightmare Creatures 1 was actually pretty cool. It was this I don't want to call it open world, but fully 3D rendered, not pre-rendered backgrounds, survival horror action game set in Victorian London with a bunch of monsters. I actually enjoyed it. It was good. The only downside to the game was the boss fights tended to be run around a giant monster in the middle of the screen, and the camera control was great for running around the streets of London. Did not work very well for running around an object. But, yeah, minor technicality. And yes, those titles were not going to set the world on fire. Can someone say, we had to fulfill a minimum contract and didn't want to piss off Sony? This is pretty much what Konami did.
Well, hey programmers, look in your recycle bins. Anything left?
Pretty much. I mean, this was really the least amount of effort Konami could have brought to the table. And while Konami nowadays is back to its roots as a gambling company, it really was still a power player at this point in the console gaming history, and they could have brought something to Dreamcast more than this.
I wonder why they were not contractually obligated to release Metal Gear Solid or a Metal Gear game on the Dreamcast. Just 5 games whatsoever.
Well, probably because the big tech demo for the PS2 before launch was Metal Gear Solid 2. That was the tech demo that they showed off of Solid Snake moving through grass with all the pieces of grass moving independently and stuff. That was the tech demo for the PS2, and we're going to talk about that in a few months. So, on to other news.
Japanese arcade show has...
Arcade show.
Arcade.
Try it one more time. From the top.
From the top, teacher. Do people know you're an English teacher?
I don't know. Do people know I'm an English teacher now that people know I am an English teacher? I'm also a lawyer, and I have a business degree, and yeah, I'm probably overqualified for this, but it's all good. So, go for it.
Yeah, feeling honored. Anywho, Japanese arcade. Yeah?
Yeah?
Okay. Show has some surprises in store.
The largest arcade show in Japan, the AOU, was held in February. Some of the big announcements were a lot of third-party games using the Naomi board from Sega. Now, we've talked about this before, but the Naomi board is the arcade version of the Dreamcast hardware. Capcom, Tecmo, and SNK are all using the platform. The most surprising thing, though, is that Sega announced that half of all Power VR chips produced, the system's GPU, would be used for Naomi, most likely to the detriment of the Dreamcast.
I wonder why they didn't bring those arcade games on their Dreamcast home console as well.
Most of them did get ported to the Dreamcast. The only problem is, remember, an arcade game is designed to give you maximum of 2 to 3 minutes of entertainment per credit, and then they want you to put more money in.
Yeah.
That kind of gameplay will wear relatively thin at home very quickly. This was the problem Sega already had with the Genesis, because they were bringing all their arcade games. They looked arcade perfect or close to it. They played like the arcade games. And after about 30 minutes, you didn't want to play them anymore. And thank God they got the sports titles. Otherwise, they would have been in real problems with that system. And so having all these arcade games is not necessarily helpful. But the Dreamcast has been out in Japan now since November. And the fact that less than 6 months later, they're announcing that half of the GPUs that they have are going to go towards their arcade business is probably not a sign that they have very great confidence for the Dreamcast as a system.
I wonder how the stock market reacted to that.
That's a very interesting question, but yeah, Sega's stock is going to go up and down. We've got a couple stories coming in the future where we talk about Sega stock, and it's not necessarily a pretty picture at this point.
No.
But they are going to get a boost in a little bit. So some of the titles: Crazy Taxi, Strider 2, Power Stone, Silent Scope, and Dead or Alive 2 debut at the show, as do a slew of rhythm games that would take over arcades for the next few years. Rhythm games were the big thing where you're jumping back and forth.
Keyboard on the board on the
But
ground.
Crazy Taxi and Strider 2 and Power Stone, absolutely phenomenal titles. All of them. A rumor is circulating that SNK and Capcom are working on a combined title, which would become the SNK v Capcom series of fighting and card battling games, alternately produced by either SNK or Capcom. So that was also a pretty interesting move, especially because those two companies really did own the market at that point, especially outside of Japan. Inside Japan, you still had Virtua Fighter as a contender for that market.
And did they?
They did release those games, yeah. And the games were quite good. I mean, especially if you're a die-hard fighting game person where you're like counting frames of animation and you really want that super balance. And the card battling games would be released on the Neo Geo Pocket. SNK is the company releasing the Neo Geo. And those still have cult status to this day. There are people who still play those games, even though the system is long dead.
Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
Next topic. Infogrames buys Accolade.
10 years earlier, just a few months ago in the show, Infogram was about to be bought out by the American game developer Epix. Now, with a new infusion of cash due to a stock market bubble in France, Infogram is going on the offensive. By purchasing Accolade, a venerable company founded by former Activision alumni in 1984, they now have a strong North American distribution arm. Infogram's rise to a position of power in the market and the control of the test drive license can finally begin. And Infogram would go on to buy a whole slew of other companies. Accolade is really their first big North American acquisition. They would end up owning the Atari name and several others. Unfortunately, they didn't know when to stop, and, well, their collapse is also coming.
Yeah, somehow typical for the industry.
Well,
to grow, and die.
It's the Peter principle.
Yeah.
You keep expanding, you keep moving up the ladder until you get to a point where your competencies no longer will sustain you, and that's when your career falters.
Yeah.
And
so stop early, guys.
No, well, just don't
Don't be
in over
ambitious.
your head. But the problem is just figuring out what you are capable of and what you're not capable of, and at what point is this opportunity something you have to pass on. It's very, very difficult when you've got the money, and they had the money through stock speculation. They had so much money. The question was, well, we may never have this money again. These companies may not be available for purchase again. If we don't buy them, somebody else will, and if somebody else buys them, they're going to have that position in the market. Yeah. They might want to buy us. Yeah. So, yeah. But the purchase of Accolade was a company way back in the day, very, very big on computers. Like I said, Test Drive, Accolade Comics was a great title that I had loved back in the day. They had some big titles, but they never made it really, really huge.
You know, and the thing is, just because they had good titles doesn't mean that they will have good titles. So
the deal with Accolade was Accolade had a distribution network.
Yeah, I totally understand that.
And
I
that's
totally understand
really
that.
what they were buying.
And Accolade, I totally understand that. But all those other companies, Infograms bought, I don't know.
Well, they bought them mainly for distribution. Like GT Interactive was a distribution network that they were really purchasing. It wasn't so much about the development at that point. It really was about becoming a major player in publishing by being able to get into all the retail outlets that they could never get into before.
Fair enough. Moving on?
Yep.
Moving on. Star Wars Episode 1, the good one. Games are previewed.
Well, okay, your definition of good one is not mine. So we just talked about how 10 years earlier, Lucasfilm had finally gotten the rights to make an Indiana Jones game. In the years after that, they would get the rights to do Star Wars games back from Atari. And finally now, as Lucas is about to release the first new Star Wars game in decades, first new Star Wars movie in decades, the LucasArts company is going to support that movie with 2 new games. One will be Episode 1 Racer, a fun, if not totally innovative racing game for PC and the N64. And the other is Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace for PC and PlayStation. And, well, the less said about that one, the better.
Actually, I had a look on it on YouTube. Well, it looked interesting.
Which one? Racer or...
no, Racer looked actually fun. Racer looked fun. I mean,
Racer
the graphics were, for the time, okay, I guess.
Yeah.
No, I mean the Phantom Menace game.
Oh, it's terrible.
Yeah.
It's an absolute clusterfuck. There's no redeemable quality about that game whatsoever, other than it follows the movie, I guess. It's just terrible.
It looked like the movie. I mean, it didn't look at all like the movie, but the plot looked like the movie's plot, and so it was basically just following the entire plot, playing the plot.
Exactly, and it would sadly become not endemic, but it would really showcase some of the weaknesses of LucasArts games going forward that were so tied to the property that they lost that freedom. And you could also tell that they're under time duress. They need to get it done at a specific time. They need to have it done for the launch. I actually played Episode 1 Racer for the first time on my first trip to Manhattan. And I was there with with some friends, and we're just walking down the street, and we suddenly see a bunch of people with giant Episode 1 shopping bags. From FAO Schwartz, the famous toy store in Manhattan. And it was like, where are you guys getting these bags from? And it was like, oh yeah, Episode 1 toys came out today. We happened to be in Manhattan on the day the toys came out. So we went to FAO Schwartz. They had a whole floor just dedicated to Star Wars toys. They had giant replicas of an AT Walker. They had stormtroopers, blah, 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 blah. Probably stuff that they had put in storage in 84 or something. But it was an amazing thing to see, and they had an N64 set up with Episode 1 Racer running on it. And you could actually play it 4-player split screen, although fog was so
hurts.
close. It got choppy. I mean, it really wasn't a great idea for a 4-player racer because unlike Mario Kart, the pods that you were racing were 3D models. They were not just cardboard cutouts like Episode 1 race, like Mario Kart.
And they were moving pretty quickly.
They were moving very, very quickly. And so, yeah, the reaction time just wasn't there. I ended up buying Episode 1 Racer later on for Windows. It used 3D acceleration. The polygon models were probably no better than the N64 version, but that fog was considerably further away. You could actually play it. It was a fun game. I enjoyed it. So.
And the other game, what I really noticed was the sound of the footsteps was so not in accordance to the character actually moving. This was off-putting.
Well, that was one of those things where you really didn't want to try doing that in a game back in the day.
Yeah.
Because getting that synchronization right was going to be difficult, especially if you were doing it on a PlayStation. Again, this was a period where, as we've talked about this, how you could emulate a PlayStation on a PC. 3D acceleration was a reality. And trying to do a cross-platform game on both PC and PlayStation at that point in time really meant that your Windows game was going to look like garbage, or you were going to have to tax the PlayStation so much and take out so many elements of the Windows version that they would almost not be the same game. The Need for Speed series did this quite a bit, where they would just change whole levels between the PlayStation release and the Windows release just because you couldn't do certain things. Other games didn't take that tact, did not think it through as thoroughly, and just did a one-to-one port, and it did lead to some very, very poor games. But, oh well. Now, our final story for May of 1999.
Yeah, speaking of sad stories, more fallout from Chainsaw Monday.
Last month we talked about Chainsaw Monday. This was the mass layoff at the original Sierra Studios in Oakhurst. And we're starting to get more and more stories being reported from people impacted by it in the magazines. So, first off, Next Generation reports that employees were given a mere week to decide if they wanted to move to the company's Seattle offices or to move to the Seattle offices to save their jobs. While the German mag PC Player reports that Havas, that was the umbrella company that owned Sierra and several others at the time, has canceled the game that would have been Leisure Suit Larry 8, the series' first 3D entry. Al Lowe has also parted ways with Sierra after 16 years with the company.
What is the distance between Oakhurst and Seattle?
You're probably talking about a 10 to 12 hour drive.
Yeah, they didn't want to keep those employees, did they?
Well, the problem was most likely not.
Well,
but Havas was not a real video game company. Havas was, and I'm probably getting a little bit of the history wrong here, but it was basically a bottled water company in France that had used the same kind of speculative cash that it funded Infogram. And they had just started building up a media empire that covered all sorts of different areas, including video games. And at the time they bought Sierra, Sierra was, if not the biggest, maybe the second biggest PC game publisher in the United States. And this meant that they were going straight into the deep end. Unfortunately, they were going straight into the deep end at a time when consoles were getting stronger and stronger, when production costs were going up and up and up. And they probably way overpaid for Sierra. I mean, the story goes that Ken Williams just threw out a number that was ridiculous. We're talking in the billions. And they took it. And he just got his billions and said, I'm out. And I can't say I blame him. I mean, obviously it was the smart move to do, especially in an ever more competitive market. But the last project he shepherded into the company right before he left was Half-Life. Sierra had the publishing rights to Half-Life.
Mm-hmm.
This could have been the place where Valve creates Steam. This could have been the company that goes into that next generation. And Sierra had already had their own online systems, their own online gaming platform, and everything else. This would have been the perfect moment for them, especially with the money Havas was bringing in. But Havas had overextended themselves. The stock market bubble in France was starting to fray. And at this point, they were just like, you know what? Yeah, we'll just close this down. We don't need it. We'll close this down. We don't need it. Oh, this project may not work. Let's get rid of it. They didn't really make any smart choices, and they started losing all the key people that were very, very important to these projects.
You know, I know your stand on economical theories, but there's one that says when companies have way too much money, they always do stupid things.
Okay.
You know, it's common knowledge, I know, but I mean, they could do smart things as well, but when they have way too much money, managers start empire building.
Well, yeah, but you could say the same thing, for example, for Google. They have way too much money. And yes, they are building an empire. Yeah. But have they really made that many dumb moves?
We'll see in 10 to 20 years.
Okay, yeah, but ultimately every company dies.
And this is how we want to end our podcast. Goodbye, everyone. Every company dies. This is what I wanted to end up with.
And you have succeeded wonderfully, because every company does die. Okay, that concludes our time travel for this month. Any final thoughts?
You know, the resume of... No, not resume, we summed up our last podcast with every company dies, but this time I want to sum up differently.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to...
Not every company lives.
Not every company lives. No. I want to point out that this time we really covered a wide array of topics besides video games. I think this is pretty awesome. We covered 5G, current technology stuff. We also covered the Peter principle, and we gave some live counseling. So, if you want to have this in surround sound, just saying. Yeah.
So, okay. I think what Peter is trying to tell everybody is that we've been in this room recording without the window being open for way too long and the oxygen is gone. So, remember, follow us on Twitter, Video Game News R2. You can send us an email at videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. You can support us on Patreon. $1 a month goes a long, long way. We finally want to be able to catch up and upload enough episodes to get this going. And we are now available on Stitcher, and I'm slowly but surely uploading all the episodes to YouTube, so you can find us there as well. And basically, that's it. Have fun.